The Vreth Empire had conquered 47 worlds. 47, each one catalogued, processed, and absorbed into the Empire's ever-expanding body like a meal. The Vreth were patient hunters. They studied a planet for decades before they moved. They watched resource levels. They measured atmospheric composition. They counted military satellites. They ran probability models on 17 different outcomes. Then, when every variable aligned, they descended. They had never lost. Not once, not even close. Commander Zhalveth stood on the observation deck of the command ship Eternal Dominion and looked at the blue planet below. It was smaller than most conquest targets, mostly water, one moon, primitive electromagnetic communications that leaked into space like a bleeding wound, radio signals, television broadcasts, early digital noise. The Vreth had been listening to those signals for 60 of this planet's years. They were not impressed. "Status report," Zhalveth said. His subordinate, Fleet-Mind Oreth, pulled up the tactical display. 700 warships arranged in a crescent formation around the planet's night side. Orbital bombardment batteries charged and ready. 300,000 ground troops in their drop pods. Everything precise. Everything calculated. "The planet's defensive systems are minimal," Oreth said. "They have approximately 4,000 nuclear warheads. Delivery systems are archaic. Their fastest aircraft move at roughly 3 times the speed of sound. Their space presence is limited to a handful of stations and unmanned probes. They are not, by any measurement, a spacefaring civilization." Zhalveth looked at Earth. There was something almost sad about it. The way it sat there in the dark, quietly spinning, its surface lit up at night with the soft glow of a billion cities. Life going on. Life not knowing. Creatures down there eating their meals, sleeping in their beds, arguing about their politics. None of them aware that 700 alien warships were parked in their shadow. "What do the cultural analysts say?" Zhalveth asked. Oreth hesitated. That hesitation was small, barely a pause, but Zhalveth noticed it. "They say the species is unusual," Oreth said carefully. "They call themselves humans. They are carbon-based, bilaterally symmetrical, oxygen-breathing, relatively short-lived by galactic standards, 70 to 90 of their years on average. They evolved as predators but developed agriculture approximately 12,000 years ago. They have been in a roughly continuous state of war with each other for most of recorded history." "With each other?" "Yes, they are intensely tribal. They have spent the majority of their civilizational energy fighting themselves. Their history is a long series of internal conflicts, territorial wars, resource wars, ideological wars. They have developed extraordinarily efficient methods of killing each other." Zhalveth found this unremarkable. Most species in early development warred among themselves. It was practically a universal constant. And their reaction to the idea of non-human intelligence? "Mixed," Oreth said. "Their cultural output, their entertainment media, their literature, shows a species deeply preoccupied with the concept. Approximately 60% of their fictional portrayals of alien contact involve conflict. Many of their greatest thinkers have expressed concern about the dangers of broadcasting their location into space." Zhalveth almost smiled. "They feared us before they knew we existed." "Yes, but they broadcast themselves anyway." That was interesting. Zhalveth filed it. Species that understood danger and broadcast into the dark anyway were either very brave or very foolish. In his experience, the distinction rarely mattered. The outcome was the same. "Begin the approach," he said. "Standard protocol. Reveal ourselves to their global communications networks. Give them 6 hours to formally surrender. Then proceed." The signal reached every television, every radio, every phone, every screen on Earth simultaneously. It overrode everything. The algorithm that did it had been perfected over 400 years of conquest. It did not ask permission. It did not knock. It simply appeared in every language the Vreth had decoded from 60 years of broadcasts, on every device that could receive a signal. A face, not a human face, something long and gray with 4 dark eyes and a mouth that moved sideways, speaking. People of Earth, you are hereby notified that your planet and all its resources have been claimed by the Vreth Dominion under the Covenant of Acquisition. You have 6 of your standard hours to transmit a formal signal of surrender. Failure to do so will result in immediate military action. Resistance is not advised. 47 civilizations have attempted it. None succeeded. You have 6 hours. Then the face disappeared, and every screen on Earth went back to its normal programming. The first 6 minutes were chaos. Not organized chaos. Not the kind of chaos that finds its shape and becomes something useful. Just pure, screaming, animal chaos. Every government in simultaneous meltdown. Every military at the highest possible alert. Every news channel running the same footage on loop because nobody had anything else to show. Every phone network simultaneously overloaded. 6 minutes of that. Then something shifted. It shifted in small places first. A military command center in the American Midwest, where a general named Ruth Okoro sat in front of a wall of screens and said, very quietly to no one in particular, "Well, okay then." She picked up a phone. It shifted in a research facility outside Moscow, where a physicist named Dmitry Volkov looked at the signal analysis his team had just run and said, "The signal used our own transmission infrastructure against us. That means they've been listening for at least 50 years. Write that down. That matters." It shifted in a submarine somewhere under the Pacific Ocean, where a crew of 40 listened to the broadcast through tinny speakers and then sat in silence for 8 seconds, and then their captain said, "Back to stations, all of you." The chaos did not stop, but underneath it something else started. Humans were wired a particular way. Millions of years of being prey had done something to the species that they had never fully examined or appreciated about themselves. When the predator appeared, when the thing that wanted to eat you finally showed its face, there was always the first wave of fear. But after the fear, something else woke up. Something old, something stubborn, something that had been sitting in the dark at the back of the brain for a very long time, waiting. The United Nations Security Council convened in 40 minutes. That was itself extraordinary. Nothing in the history of the organization had ever convened it that fast. Ambassadors were physically running through corridors. Translation earpieces were being shoved in at angles. Coffee cups were left behind. The Secretary General, a small Kenyan woman named Amara Ndiaye, sat at the head of the table and looked at the faces around her. Some were pale, some were sweating. One man was quietly praying under his breath. Another was on his 3rd glass of water and it was not helping. Amara Ndiaye had spent 30 years in diplomacy. She had negotiated in rooms where the wrong word ended lives. She knew what fear looked like in powerful people. She was looking at it now. She let the silence sit for exactly 4 seconds, long enough to land, short enough to not let it take root. "We have 5 hours and 46 minutes, she said. "I don't want to spend any of it on panic. I want to spend it on options. Who has them?" Nobody spoke immediately. Then a hand went up. A young man from the Indian delegation, a military analyst named Rao who had been pulled in because he happened to be in the building. He looked like he had not slept in 2 days before this, and now he was simply in a different category of awake. "We can't fight them in space," he said. "We have nothing there. We know that. They know we know that. So the real question is whether surrender buys us anything or whether we fight on the surface and make it expensive for them. Make it so expensive they start calculating whether we're worth it." "You're suggesting we make them bleed," said the Russian ambassador. "I'm suggesting we make them count," Rao said. "They've conquered 47 worlds. We don't know the cost of those conquests. We know they won, but we don't know what winning cost them. If we make the cost of Earth high enough that they leave, the American representative said. There was something in her voice that was not quite skepticism and not quite hope. High enough that leaving is the rational decision, Rao said. Yes. Amara India looked at him for a long moment. Keep talking, she said. Up in the eternal dominion, the 6-hour countdown ticked forward with the mechanical certainty of everything Jalveth did. He did not watch the planet's communications with any great interest. The Vreth had seen the reaction pattern before. Panic, emergency councils, desperate broadcasts of surrender signals, or angry broadcasts of defiance, or sometimes both simultaneously from different governments on the same planet. The Vreth translator teams were monitoring everything, filing reports, flagging anything unusual. At the 4-hour mark, a report came through that Jalveth almost dismissed. He read it twice instead. They're sharing military data, Orath said, reading alongside him. All of it, simultaneously, every nation. They're pooling resources, weapon systems, infrastructure data, vulnerability assessments. They're giving it to each other. Which faction is leading the coordination? Orath checked again. All of them, Commander, they're not waiting for a leader. They're coordinating in a distributed manner. No central command point. He paused. They're communicating faster than our translator systems can process. Jalveth said nothing. They're also not transmitting a surrender signal, Orath added. That was not unusual. Some species spent the full 6 hours hopping for a miracle. Some tried to negotiate. Some simply failed to agree among themselves in time, and the window passed without any signal at all. What was unusual was the activity pattern. The Vreth had sophisticated electromagnetic monitoring. They could measure communication volume across a planet's surface. They had a baseline established from 60 years of observation. They knew what normal human communication volume looked like. It had tripled in the last hour. Not in a panic pattern. Panic had a specific signature. It was high volume but low coherence. Random, noise. This was not noise. This was high volume and high coherence. Organized, purposeful, like a species that had sat down and gotten to work. Have any other conquest targets shown this communication pattern in the surrender window? Jalveth asked. Orath searched the records. It took time. He searched back through 47 worlds. No, he said. Jalveth looked at the blue planet again. It sat there in its orbit, serene and water-covered, completely unremarkable to the eye. His scanners showed 7 billion organic life forms moving around on its surface. Short-lived, meat-based, no energy weapons, no shielding technology, no faster-than-light capability. He felt nothing he could name as concern. But he felt something. Get me a full cultural analysis package, he said. Everything, not just military, their art, their history, their religions, their children's stories. Orath looked at him. This was not standard protocol. This was not something they had needed for 47 worlds. We have 5 hours left in the window, Jalveth said. Use them. The cultural analysis package arrived in 2 hours. Jalveth read it in his private quarters, alone. He had served in the Vreth Dominion for 90 years. He had participated in 11 conquests. He was not a creature that frightened easily or at all. He read the history sections first. The wars. The scope of them was notable, not because the humans were powerful, they were not, but because of what they did inside those wars, the scale of the losses they absorbed and continued. A conflict they called the Second World War, 60 to 80 million dead. The species did not stop. They did not fracture permanently. They eventually ended the war and rebuilt everything that had been destroyed within a single generation. They built it better than before. He read their literature. Strange, dense things full of violence and love and a persistent, irrational insistence on hope. Their stories almost universally featured individuals who were outmatched by stronger enemies, by fate, by the universe itself, and who fought anyway. Not always winning, but always fighting. He read their religious texts, dozens of competing belief systems, many of which were used historically as justifications for killing each other. And yet the baseline moral content of most of them was strikingly similar. Protect your group. Sacrifice for those who cannot protect themselves. Do not yield. He read their children's stories. That was where he stopped for a long time. A species taught its children very early, very consistently, a specific lesson, that the monster could be faced, that the dark had an end, that the small and the frightened could, if they were brave enough and clever enough, defeat the large and the powerful. They told this to their children, over and over, in 1,000 different ways, in 1,000 different cultures, across thousands of years. He thought about that. Then he went back to the observation deck. Earth was still there, still spinning, still lit up on the night side with its billion soft lights, 40 minutes left in the surrender window. No surrender signal. Orath appeared beside him, orders commander. Jalveth looked at the planet for a long moment. Pull the full military engagement protocol, he said, but I want a documentation team standing by. I want every stage of this recorded. For the victory archive. For the analysis archive, Jalveth said, I want to know exactly what this costs us. It was the first time in 90 years of service that he had said something like that before an engagement had even begun. He did not examine the reason. The countdown reached 0. No surrender signal came. And the Vreth Dominion, for the 48th time in its history, began a conquest. For the first time in its history, the outcome was not already decided. The first drop pods hit at dawn. 300,000 Vreth ground troops deployed simultaneously across 6 continents. Standard doctrine: hit everywhere at once. Overwhelm the defensive response. Give the enemy too many fires to put out. It had worked on 47 worlds. It had worked on species with actual space-based defenses, actual energy weapon platforms, actual military technology that dwarfed anything the humans possessed. The pods came down like burning rain. And then the humans started shooting. Sergeant First Class Maya Torres was in a ditch in rural Kansas when the first pod hit the ground 300 meters away. She had 12 soldiers with her. They had been in that ditch for 40 minutes, positioned there based on a broadcast from a military channel that had told every active-duty soldier in the country, in plain language with no encryption, they are coming. Get to cover. Wait. Do not engage until you have a target. Simple instructions, clear instructions. The kind of instructions that worked when people were scared and needed something concrete to do. The pod opened. What came out was about 2.5 meters tall, gray-green, 4-limbed, but with an extra joint in each arm. It wore dark armor. It carried a weapon that Maya had never seen before, which fired pulses of something that was definitely not a bullet and definitely not a laser, and definitely left a hole in whatever it touched. Maya looked at it. She had been in the army for 11 years. She had done 2 tours in places that had broken people she knew. She was not easily shaken. But looking at that thing climb out of that pod, she felt something in her chest pull tight, like a rope somebody was shortening on the other end. She breathed out. Fire, she said. 12 rifles opened up. Standard 5.56 rounds, nothing special, the same ammunition her unit had been issued for training exercises the week before this happened. The Vreth soldier in the field turned toward them, and she saw its armor absorb the first volley, deflect most of it at least, but not all of it. The thing staggered. She filed that information without analyzing it, the way you filed things under fire. It could be hit. Reload, fire, move. She was already moving, pulling her team left, keeping them shifting, not letting them be a static target for that pulse weapon. Do not stop moving, keep it busy. 3 more pods hit in the next 30 seconds. This was going to be a long morning. The Vreth Operational Command Center, registered something anomalous within the first 12 minutes of the ground engagement. Casualty projections were models. They were not guesses. They were carefully calculated statistical outcomes based on the data gathered during the observation period. The Vreth knew the humans' weapons. They knew their armor ratings. They had calculated expected soldier loss per engagement type, per terrain type, per defensive position. The models were wrong. Not massively wrong. Not in a way that suggested catastrophic failure, but wrong in ways that compounded. The humans were moving differently than the models predicted. They were not holding defensive positions. They were using terrain in ways the aerial surveillance suggested were tactically unusual, disappearing into ground cover, reappearing somewhere unexpected, forcing the Vreth units to slow down and search rather than advance in their standard sweeping formation. More notably, the humans were not communicating through their regular networks. The Vreth had mapped those networks. They had been prepared to jam them, but the humans had switched not to encrypted military channels, which the Vreth had also mapped, but to old, low-tech, almost primitive communication methods. Runners, physical signals, radio frequencies so low bandwidth they had been dismissed as weather equipment. Fleetmind Oreth filed a report to Jalveth at the 14-minute mark. Engagement proceeding within acceptable parameters. Recommend continued monitoring of communication evasion tactics. He did not file it with the confidence he normally felt writing such reports. In a mountain range in Afghanistan, a man named Rashid had been fighting something or someone for most of his adult life. He was 51 years old. He had grown up in a country that had been at war for his entire life, and for 2 decades before he was born. He had a detailed and practical understanding of how to make foreign military forces miserable in terrain that favored the defender. He had never expected to be using that knowledge in defense of the same government that had once been his enemy. But aliens had invaded, and there were things that overrode old grievances. He had gathered 27 men and women from several different factions that would, in any other month, not have shared the same mountain. They were sharing it now. They had their weapons, their knowledge of the ground, their experience in a particular kind of warfare that was not about winning battles. It was about making every meter of ground cost more than it was worth. The Vreth unit that entered his valley that morning was 40 soldiers. They were larger than humans. They had better weapons. Their armor was significantly better than anything he had faced before. He let them walk into the valley for 6 minutes before he gave the signal. The valley turned into something the Vreth soldiers had no tactical framework for. Explosions from angles that should have been impossible. Attackers who appeared for seconds and then vanished into the ground. Losses that came from directions their sensors did not register as threats. He knew this type of fight the way he knew breathing. He had grown up inside it. The 40-soldier Vreth unit took 11 casualties in 3 minutes. 11 out of 40. A casualty rate of over 25% in less than 5 minutes of engagement. By galactic standards, this was not unusual in a difficult terrain engagement. The Vreth military had absorbed worse. What was unusual was the next part. The Vreth unit fell back to regroup. Standard tactical response. You pull back, you reassess, you call for support. When the support arrived, another 60 soldiers, orbital fire direction capability, 3 aerial units, they found the valley empty. 27 people had simply dissolved into rock and scrub and shadow, and left no heat signature that the sensors could reliably distinguish from the terrain itself. Rashid was 2 ridges away by then, moving his people toward the next valley. He was already thinking about the next one. By hour 6 of the ground engagement, the Vreth had taken a city. One city, exactly one, a mid-sized metropolitan area on the eastern coast of North America, taken at significant cost and currently occupied by a force that was, already, being systematically harassed from every direction by civilians who should, by every model the Vreth possessed, have been cowering. They were not cowering. A woman in that city threw a homemade fire device at an armored Vreth vehicle from a third-floor window. She was killed by the return fire. The vehicle was disabled. A man who had spent 30 years as a plumber had rigged the water mains under the occupied district to pump something flammable through the system on a timer. 2 engineers had spent 6 hours rewiring a substation to deliver a specific type of electrical surge to anything metal that connected to the power grid in a 14-block radius. None of these things were coordinated by a central command. They were coordinated by the same distributed, decentralized communication pattern the Vreth analysts had flagged in the pre-invasion period. People talking to each other. People making decisions at the smallest possible unit level. People not waiting for permission. The Vreth found this deeply, structurally confusing. Every other species they had conquered had a center, a government, a command structure. You destroyed or captured the center and the periphery collapsed. That was how it always worked. It was how civilization worked. You had hierarchy. You had a head. You cut off the head. The humans had a head, technically. They had governments. They had military commands. The Vreth orbital platforms had targeted all of them in the first hour, the government buildings, the military headquarters, the communication centers. The humans had noticed their command structures were gone, and then had proceeded to function without them. Jalveth read the 6-hour report in silence. He read it twice. He had a habit of doing that lately. The numbers were not catastrophic. The Vreth forces were advancing slowly on every front. They had taken ground. They had destroyed military infrastructure. They had inflicted significant human casualties. The models estimated 1 to 2 million dead in the first 6 hours, primarily from orbital strikes. 1 to 2 million dead. He let himself sit with that number for a moment. On the 4th world they had conquered a species called the Yeth. The estimate of 1 million dead in the first 6 hours had produced an immediate, planet-wide surrender signal. The surviving population had been broadcasting surrender for 4 hours before that mark. The humans were not broadcasting surrender. They were broadcasting recruitment calls. He had the translation in front of him, thousands of them, different languages, different formats, but the same content. They are here. They are real. Find your people. Get to work. Orath entered. He had the look of someone managing a piece of information carefully. Commander, we've completed the full 6-hour tactical analysis. And Orath set a data pad on the surface in front of him. The numbers were organized neatly. Vreth casualties by engagement type, ammunition expenditure, support unit requests, resource burn rate. The resource burn rate was the one that landed. At this rate, Orath said, pacifying Earth to the point of administrative control will take approximately. Tell me the number. Orath's mouth moved sideways, the Vreth equivalent of a wince. 11 years, at minimum, assuming we do not encounter significant escalation. 11 years. The 47 worlds combined had taken a total of 9 years, all of them together. One planet, one species with no space capability, no energy weapons, no shielding technology. One species of short-lived, meat-based, primitive creatures who had spent most of their history fighting each other. 11 years. Jalveth looked out the observation window at Earth. It was still turning, still lit. The city they'd taken glowed differently now. There were fires in it that were not the fires of orbital bombardment. Those were smaller fires, ground-level fires. The kind that meant somebody down there was making the night difficult for whoever occupied their streets. He thought about the children's stories. The small and the frightened, brave enough, clever enough, facing the large and powerful. He did not feel afraid. He was not built for fear in any simple way, but he felt something that occupied a similar space. Something that said, pay attention, this is different. Increase ground force deployment by 30%, he said. I want continuous orbital coverage of all major communication centers, and I want every engagement today fully documented. For the Victory Archive, Oreth asked again. For the Senate, Jalveth said. When we return home, I want them to understand exactly what we found down there. He left the observation deck. Below him, Earth burned in small, stubborn fires. And kept fighting. In a basement in Seoul, 3 teenagers had hacked into a Vreth drone's navigation system. They did not know if it would work. They had been trying for 4 hours based on what they had reverse-engineered from 2 minutes of watching the drone fly past their window. They had no training for this. They had a laptop, 2 external drives, a soldering kit, and the particular type of laser focus that belongs to people who are 17 and have decided that being afraid is something they will do later. The drone turned. It went in the direction they told it to go. One of them started crying, not from fear. The other 2 looked at each other. Okay, said the one in the middle, what else can we get into? On the Eternal Dominion an alert pinged in the Signals Intelligence Department. Drone Unit KV-447 had been remotely compromised. The analyst who received the alert stared at it for a long moment. Then she flagged it to her supervisor, who flagged it to Orath, who held it in his hands and read it 3 times and felt, for the first time in his career, the specific discomfort of facing something his training had not prepared him for. He did not file it in the standard operations log. He put it in the analysis archive Jalveth had asked for. It was going to be a very full archive. On the 9th day, they nuked themselves. Not all of them. Not by accident. A very specific, very deliberate decision made by a committee of 3 generals and 1 civilian in an underground bunker in Central Asia, with full knowledge of what they were doing and why. The Vreth had been funneling a major concentration of ground troops through a specific mountain corridor for 6 hours. The corridor was the fastest route between 2 occupied territories. The Vreth commanders had calculated that its geography made it difficult to defend with conventional weapons. They had calculated correctly. They had also calculated that the humans would not destroy the corridor itself, because the corridor ran through a populated region, and the humans had, in every engagement so far, shown restraint about inflicting casualties on their own civilians. They had calculated incorrectly. The 3 generals and the 1 civilian looked at the map. They looked at each other. The civilian was a woman who had been a city planner 2 weeks ago. She had been pulled into the bunker because she knew infrastructure. She had spent 3 days learning things that city planners do not normally need to know. She looked at the population data. She looked at the troop concentration data. She did the math nobody wanted to do. The civilians in that area are gone, she said. We moved them out over the last 4 days. I can verify that. But if that troop column reaches the 2nd territory, she did not finish the sentence. She did not need to. The 3 generals looked at the map a little longer. Do it, the senior one said. The warhead was 60 years old. It was smaller than the ones in the films. When it went off in the mountain pass, it did not level a city. It collapsed a corridor. It turned a navigable route into 100 kilometers of unstable, radioactive rubble that no army could move through for months. It took approximately 9,000 Vreth soldiers with it. Up on the Eternal Dominion every alarm in the fleet fired simultaneously. Orath was on the bridge in under a minute, watching the sensor readings, and for a long moment he simply could not process what he was seeing. They used a nuclear weapon, he said. Yes, said the analyst beside him. On their own territory. Yes. Against ground troops. He was not asking questions. He was running the facts through his mind, looking for the place where they made sense. Their own territory, voluntarily radioactive, to stop a troop advance. Commander Jalveth is being notified, the analyst said carefully. Oreth stood there for another moment. In 47 conquests, the Vreth had never seen a species deliberately irradiate its own land. Every species, at the core, prioritized the preservation of territory. That was a universal. You conquered to acquire resources, to acquire land. Land was the point. You did not destroy your own land. Unless the land was secondary to something else. Jalveth received the notification and went back to his quarters. He pulled up the cultural analysis package again. He went to the history section. He read it differently now. He had read it before looking for tactical information. He read it now looking for the thing underneath the tactics. He found a pattern. It ran through every major conflict in human history. It was not a tactic. It was not a doctrine. It was something so embedded in the species' behavior that they probably did not recognize it as a choice. They did not surrender territory. They destroyed it first. A city called Moscow, 1812. The inhabitants burned it themselves rather than let an invader have it intact. They left the invader a shell and a winter. Islands in the Pacific, 1940s. Defenders who were completely outmatched, holding positions until there was nothing left to hold. Not because victory was possible, because making it cost something was the only option available and they took it. A city called Leningrad, 900 days, no supplies, catastrophic casualties. They ate whatever they could find. They did not surrender. A battle called Thermopylae, 300 men and several thousand allies against a force orders of magnitude larger. Every tactical analyst the Vreth had would have filed that engagement as a guaranteed loss before the first hour. The humans had fought it anyway, for 3 days. He found a phrase in their cultural texts. Multiple languages, multiple cultures, the same concept. If I must fall, I will make the ground shake. He found another one. Make them pay for every inch. And another, take one with you. He put the data pad down. The thing he had been refusing to name since the beginning of this engagement had a shape now. He looked at it directly. The Vreth were a conquering civilization. They operated on the premise that conquest was rational, that acquiring resources and territory through force was the efficient path to civilizational growth. It was rational. It worked. 47 worlds. But rationality was a calculation, and every calculation had inputs. The inputs for Earth were wrong. Not because the humans could stop the Vreth in any conventional sense. They could not. They did not have the technology. They did not have the numbers. They did not have the weapons. On every objective measure, this engagement had only one possible conclusion. The Vreth would win. Jalveth knew it. Every fleet officer knew it. What the models had not included as an input was the cost. Not the cost in absolute terms. The cost in time, in resources, in Vreth lives. In the slow, grinding attrition of a species that refused, constitutionally, it seemed, at a species level to stop. A species that would irradiate its own mountains. That would fight with agricultural tools if that was what was available. That had a 1,000-year history of doing exactly this and had never in that entire history been fully conquered. 11 years. That was the minimum estimate, and that estimate had been generated before the nuclear strike. Jalveth called for a full command staff meeting. The meeting was tense, in a way that Vreth command meetings were not supposed to be. They were not supposed to be tense because conquests were not supposed to be uncertain. The Vreth had a method. The method worked. Tense meetings meant something had gone outside the method, and outside the method was a place none of them had practiced operating. Jalveth laid the analysis on the table, the resource projections, the time projections, the casualty rates by engagement type, the nuclear incident, the hacked drone. He laid all of it out and let the command staff read. They read in silence. These projections can be improved, said Fleet Admiral Scareth. the most senior officer in the room after Jalveth. He said it the way you say something when you are not sure it is true but you need it to be. If we escalate orbital bombardment, we destroy what we came for, Jalveth said. The planet's value is in its resources. If we sterilize the surface to end resistance, we return to the Senate with a radioactive rock. Scarith was quiet. If we continue ground engagement at current intensity, Jalveth continued, the projection holds 11 years, during which time, based on observed adaptation rates, the humans will become progressively harder to fight. They are, he paused, looking for the right word. They are learning. Every engagement teaches them something about how we fight. They share what they learn. They adapt. The adaptation rate is faster than our projections accounted for. What are you recommending? Asked the junior admiral. The room went still. I am recommending we pause ground operations, Jalveth said. Pull back to orbit, maintain the blockade, and consult with the Senate before proceeding. The silence that followed had a specific texture. It was the silence of professionals who had never heard a command like that, and who were not sure what feeling to attach to it. Scarith said slowly, "We have never paused a conquest." "We have never encountered this," Jalveth said. "Pulling back will be seen as weakness by the humans." Jalveth looked at him for a long moment. "They irradiated a mountain range to stop one of our troop columns. They are running a distributed military resistance with no central command. They hacked a drone with equipment we classify as primitive." He paused. "I am not concerned with how they interpret our withdrawal. I am concerned with the Senate's interpretation of an 11-year engagement with no clear endpoint against a species that has not yet fielded its full resistance capacity." Scarith absorbed this. "They haven't even gotten to their full capacity yet," a junior officer said. He had been quiet for the entire meeting. "We don't know what their full capacity looks like," Jalveth said. "That is precisely the problem." The ground withdrawal order reached the frontline units at hour 214 of the invasion. It took a while for Maya Torres to believe it. She was watching through binoculars from a hillside position when the Vreth units in the valley below started pulling back, systematically, orderly, the way military units withdraw when they are retreating on purpose, not when they are running. There was no chase. There was nothing to chase. They just left. "What is happening?" said the corporal next to her. "I don't know," Maya said. "Are they?" "I do not know," she said again. "Watch." They watched for 20 minutes. The Vreth units continued to pull back toward their landing sites. The landing site vehicles powered up. The pods launched. Up, up, up into the sky and then gone, swallowed by the blue. Maya lowered her binoculars. Her hands, she noticed, were shaking. Not from fear. From something that had been held tight for 9 days and had not been allowed to release and was now, in the sudden stillness, not sure what to do with itself. She sat down on the hillside. Around her, the other 11 soldiers also sat down. One woman started crying. One man laughed, a short, sharp, involuntary sound. One young soldier, he was 20, he had been a student 9 days ago, put his head between his knees and breathed. Maya looked up at the sky. Clear, blue, nothing in it that she could see with the naked eye, but she knew they were up there. She knew this wasn't over. She thought about what it meant that they had pulled back. She thought about it for a long time. "Sergeant," said the corporal, "what do we do now?" She thought about that too. "We dig in," she said. "We rest, we eat, we dig in, and we assume they're coming back. Because they are." She paused. "And next time we'll be better at this than we were this time." She stood up. Her legs were tired. Everything in her was tired. "And so will everyone else," she said. "That's the difference." Up on the asterisk Eternal Dominion asterisk, the Senate liaison arrived by faster-than-light relay. A narrow, angular Vreth in formal robes who had clearly been pulled out of sleep and was managing the indignity with diplomatic professionalism. He carried the Senate's formal response to Jalveth's situation report. Jalveth read it. The Senate did not approve of the pause. They wanted the engagement completed. They had, however, authorized an additional 300 warships and a second ground force deployment of 500,000 troops. And they wanted a full briefing, in person, at Senate headquarters. They had never requested a full briefing during an active conquest before. Jalveth set the relay document down. He looked at Earth one more time. From this distance, you couldn't see the fires. You couldn't see the craters from 9 days of bombardment. You couldn't see the burned mountain pass or the occupied city with its stubborn small fires or the young soldiers in their hillside positions looking up at the same sky. It just looked blue. He thought, the Senate is going to ask me what we are dealing with. He thought about how to answer that. The honest answer was one he had been building in the analysis archive for 9 days now. A dossier, data, engagement reports, casualty projections, adaptation rates, the cultural package, the history sections. He would bring all of it. And he would tell the Senate the truth. We have found something we have never found before. A species that does not know how to stop. Not because they are strong, not because they are advanced, but because somewhere in their evolutionary history, something wired them to keep going past the point where any rational calculation would say stop. And that wiring, that irrational, deeply embedded refusal, is the only weapon they have, and it may be enough. He filed the thought away. Then he gave the order to set course for Senate headquarters. Behind him, Earth continued to turn. It had been doing that for 4 billion years. It was not planning to stop now. The Senate of the Vreth Dominion had existed for 800 years. In that time it had authorized 47 conquests. It had denied 0. It had reversed 0. It had paused 1. The chamber was large enough to hold 1,200 senators and their staff, arranged in rising tiers around a central floor where a speaker stood alone and spoke to the room. The design was meant to make the speaker feel small. Most speakers did. Jalveth was not most speakers. He stood on the floor of the Senate chamber and looked up at 1,200 Vreth faces and felt, for the first time in a very long time, something close to impatience. He had things to say, important things. He needed the room to understand them. The room was not, at present, inclined to understand. High Senator Dravoth, who had held that position for 40 years, and who had personally authorized 11 of the 47 conquests, was speaking from his elevated position with the particular tone of someone who had decided to be dismissive before the meeting started. "You are telling us," Dravoth said, "that one planet, an uncontacted pre-spaceflight civilization with no energy weapons, no shielding technology, and no interstellar capability, has required a pause in conquest operations and a personal briefing before the Senate." "Yes," Jalveth said. "After 9 days." "Yes." 47 worlds, Dravoth said, and the room felt the weight of those words. "We have taken 47 worlds, some of them with actual space-based military capability, some of them with weapons that genuinely threatened our fleet. We did not pause for any of them." "No," Jalveth agreed, "we did not." "Then explain to me what is different." Jalveth looked at the room for a moment. Then he loaded the first file from the analysis archive onto the chamber's projection system. The Senate chambers were designed for large-scale data display. The displays were used typically for resource projections and territorial maps. He showed them something different. He showed them the resource burn rate projection, 11 years. He let that number sit in the air of the chamber for a long time. "Our current resource expenditure on Earth," he said, "is operating at a rate that will require 11 years of continuous engagement to achieve administrative control. That is not an aggressive estimate. That is a conservative one. It was generated before the humans deployed their first nuclear weapon on their own territory. It was generated before they began adapting our drone navigation systems. It was generated before they demonstrated an organized civilian resistance network that our models did not account for. The chamber was quiet. The 47th world, Jalveth continued, required 14 months of engagement. The longest prior engagement before that was 22 months. Both of those species had military technology that posed genuine threats to our fleet. Earth does not. What Earth has is, he paused, choosing the word carefully, a biological disposition towards sustained resistance that we have not previously encountered. He loaded the cultural analysis package onto the display. They have been fighting each other for 12,000 years, he said. Continuously. Not all of them, not all the time, but the pattern is unbroken. Every major civilizational stress event, famine, disease, external pressure, has produced the same response. Not collapse, adaptation. They restructure around the stress. They absorb casualties at a rate that would have ended the resistance of every species we have previously engaged, and they continue. He pulled up the engagement reports from the 9 days, unit by unit. Engagement by engagement, what the models predicted and what happened instead. They are not fighting us because they believe they can win, he said. I want to be clear about that. They know at the command level that they cannot win in conventional military terms. I have read their internal communications. He paused. They are fighting us because the alternative, surrender, is not something the species is structurally capable of. There is no command I can give that will make them stop. There is no center I can capture that will make the rest collapse. They have no such center. They are, he thought about how to say it, they are the most decentralized military force I have ever encountered, and they are becoming more effective at fighting us with every engagement, not less. High Senator Dravoth made a sound that might have been contempt and might have been discomfort. You are describing primitives with rocks. I am describing primitives with rocks who have already cost us 9,000 soldiers in 9 days, Jalveth said, on a planet we expected to pacify in 3 months. Primitives with rocks who irradiated a mountain pass rather than let us use it. Primitives with rocks who access the navigation system of our drone hardware using equipment we classify as archaic. He paused. And they have had 9 days. They have now had 9 days to study how we fight, to share that information, to adapt. And they are, he pulled up the adaptation rate analysis. They are adapting faster than any species in our engagement history. He let the number sit. What is your recommendation? Asked Senator Velrasha, a younger senator who had been leaning forward since Jalveth began. She had the look of someone actually listening. Jalveth had thought about this carefully for the 8 days of transit from Earth. He had thought about it the way he thought about strategy, without sentiment, without ego, just the numbers and what they meant. I have 2 recommendations, he said. The first is that we increase the engagement force as the Senate has authorized, but change the engagement approach. Stop trying to hold ground. Stop trying to establish administrative control. Shift to targeted elimination of industrial infrastructure. Make it economically impossible for them to sustain the resistance. This will take longer than 11 years, but it will reduce our casualty rate. And the second. Jalveth looked at the chamber. He had been serving the Dominion for 90 years. He had never said what he was about to say in any setting to any person. He said it now because the math left him no other choice. The second recommendation is that we leave. The chamber erupted. Not in noise, exactly. In the specific way 1,200 people who have never needed to react to something like that all react to it simultaneously. Movement, sound, the particular texture of a room discovering it does not have a script for this moment. Dravoth's voice cut through it. Withdrawal from an active conquest is surrender. Withdrawal from Earth is a resource decision, Jalveth said, and his voice carried across the room the way a voice does when someone is not attempting to shout and does not need to. We are a conquering civilization. We conquer to expand our resource base. The The question we need to ask is not whether we can defeat Earth. We can, eventually. The question is whether the cost of doing so is worth what we would gain. He brought up the resource assessment. Earth's resources are significant but not unique. We have other options in that sector. Options that do not come with an 11-year engagement against a species that will make us work for every meter of ground. He let that settle. What I am recommending, he said, is that we make a rational decision, not an emotional one, not a decision based on precedent, a decision based on the actual numbers of what Earth will cost us, against what it will give us, against what other targets in that sector could give us at a fraction of the cost. The chamber was quiet in a different way now. Dravoth said, "If we withdraw, every uncontacted species in the galaxy will know that resistance defeated the Vreth." Every uncontacted species in the galaxy, Jalveth said, does not have Earth's history, does not have Earth's biology, does not have 9,000 years of continuous internal warfare that produced a species with this specific set of characteristics. He paused. I am not suggesting resistance can defeat us as a general principle. I am suggesting that this specific species on this specific world is a poor return on investment, and that treating it as a special case, a costly anomaly, is the rational response. The debate went on for 3 days. On Earth, they did not know about the Senate debate. What they knew was that the Vreth ships were still in orbit, still there, blocking the sky, blocking the signals they were trying to send into space, still present in the way that a predator is present even when it is sitting still, the potential for it to move filling the air like pressure. Amara Ndiaye had not slept properly in 9 days. She was running on coffee and the specific adrenaline that belongs to people who have decided there is no option for stopping. She had been told, by the generals and admirals who now operated without their command centers, that the Vreth ground forces had pulled back. She did not take this as good news. She took it as a pause. She spent the pause the way the rest of the planet's military was spending it. Getting better. The 9 days of engagement had produced, in the human resistance, the most concentrated and rapidly disseminated military learning event in the species' history. Every soldier, every militia unit, every improvised resistance group that had engaged with a Vreth ground unit had generated information. That information had been collected, processed, and distributed with the same distributed network efficiency that had confused the Vreth command systems. They now knew the armor rating of the standard Vreth ground soldier. They knew the frequency signature of the pulse weapons. They knew the thermal profile of the drop pods, which meant you could hear them coming from a significant distance if you had the right equipment. And the right equipment had been rigged from standard weather monitoring hardware by a team in Finland who had shared the design globally in under 48 hours. They knew the Vreth sensory systems had a gap in the very low-frequency radio band, which was why the Vreth jamming had not been fully effective, and why that gap needed to be protected and used. They knew the drones had an exploitable navigation protocol. 3 independent teams on 3 continents had confirmed it now, and the exploit was being taught to anyone who could be reached. They knew that the Vreth commanders operated on a hierarchy that, when disrupted, produced a delay in orders reaching the unit level. The window of that delay was approximately 4 minutes. 4 minutes where a Vreth unit, without orders, defaulted to a holding pattern. 4 minutes was a long time. The pause was a gift. They used every second of it. On the 3rd day of the Senate debate, a junior senator from a small provincial territory stood up during one of the rare quiet moments and said something that nobody else had said. Her name was Sevmura. She was young for the Senate. She had been elected because her region was wealthy and she was clever, not because she had military experience or conquest history. She had been sitting through 3 days of debate about resource projections and engagement costs and casualty rates, and she had been quiet because this was not her domain. But she had been listening. She said, May I ask Commander Jalveth a question that is not about the resource projections? A slight pause, then Jalveth looked up at her position. Ask it. You have read everything we know about these humans, she said. The cultural material, the history, the engagement reports, all of it. She paused. What do you think of them? The chamber was quiet. It was not a Senate question. It was not a strategic question or a resource question. It was a human kind of question, actually, the kind of question that wanted to know what a person thought, not what the numbers said. Jalveth stood with it for a moment. I think, he said slowly, that they are the most dangerous thing we have encountered in 800 years of expansion. Because of their weapons. No, their weapons are primitive, he paused. Because of what they are willing to do, because there is no version of this conflict, no level of cost, no scale of damage at which they will decide the calculation does not work and stop. That is not a failure of their thinking. That is, I believe, a feature of their biology. They evolved as a prey species that survived by refusing to be killed. That survival mechanism never went dormant. It is still active. It will be active as long as any of them are alive. He paused again. And they have 7 billion of them. Sevmira was quiet for a moment. So if we continue, she said. We will win, Jalveth said. Eventually, and it will cost us more than any conquest in our history, by a significant margin. She sat back. The chamber deliberated for another full day. On the 4th day, the Senate voted. It was the first contested vote on a conquest decision in the history of the Vreth Dominion. The result was not unanimous. But it was a result. The order reached Jalveth on the morning of the 5th day. He read it. He did not show expression. He was not a creature who showed expression in any human-readable way. But he stood with the order for a long moment, alone in his quarters before he went to the bridge. The order was one that would be whispered about in Vreth corridors for generations. The order that had no precedent. The order that the Dominion would argue about for 100 years, whether it was wisdom or cowardice, pragmatism or defeat. It was 3 words. Leave the humans. Jalveth folded the order and put it in his formal archive. Then he went to the bridge of the Eternal Dominion and gave the fleet its instructions. 700 warships began to move. Not down, not toward Earth. Away. On the surface, they saw it happen. Not the order, not the Senate debate, they saw the ships. 700 points of light in the night sky, distributed across the upper atmosphere and then, over the course of 6 hours, moving, rearranging, shifting slowly in a direction that was not down. That was not the direction you would go if you were repositioning for a new attack pattern. That was the direction you went when you were leaving. Maya Torres was on her hillside when it happened. She watched the lights move for a long time without saying anything. The soldiers around her were also watching. Nobody spoke. The night was very quiet. 1 light, then 2, then all of them, slowly gathering their great distances and heading somewhere else. The sky got back its dark. Maya Torres sat on her hillside and watched the last of the lights disappear, and then she sat there a little longer in the quiet that came after, and she did not cry. She had not cried in 9 days because she had not been able to afford it. She still could not afford it technically. The ships were gone, but the work was not done. The cities were damaged. The mountain pass was radioactive. People were dead. A lot of people were dead. The work of after was going to be long. She sat with all of that. Then she picked up her radio, hit the frequency. The low one, the gap in the Vreth jamming band, the one that had carried communications for 9 days through everything the enemy had thrown at it. This is Torres, South Kansas position. The lights are gone. What's the status? A burst of static, then a voice she did not recognize coming from somewhere far away saying, "Same here. They're gone. They're all gone." A pause. What do we do now? Maya Torres looked at the dark sky. Now we figure out what just happened, she said, "and we make sure we're ready in case they come back." She lowered the radio. Above her, the sky was just sky again, just stars, just the old dark that had been there before any of this, waiting patiently to be itself again. For now, it was enough. The galaxy found out the way things always find out. Not quickly, not through any single channel, but in the way that information travels between civilizations that are watching each other from a careful distance, through traders and scouts and diplomatic observation posts, and the long, slow spread of intercepted signals. The Vreth Dominion had left a planet, undefeated. It took 2 years for this information to become reliably confirmed. It took another year for it to stop sounding like a mistake. The Galactic Assembly of Independent States was not a powerful organization. It was not meant to be. It was meant to be a place where civilizations that were not part of the Vreth Dominion could communicate with each other without being eaten. It had 41 member species. It had a large building on a neutral asteroid. It had a lot of meetings that rarely resulted in anything concrete. 3 years after the withdrawal from Earth, it had its most attended meeting in 6 decades. Every member species sent their full delegation. Several non-member species sent observers. The Vreth Dominion sent nobody, which was normal. They were not members, and they found the assembly unnecessary. The fact that they found it unnecessary was itself one of the assembly's ongoing anxieties. Ambassador T. Laren of the Solvathi, a species that had been nearly conquered by the Vreth 40 years prior, and had survived by giving up their outer colonies and retreating to their home system, opened the session. "We are here," she said, "to discuss what happened at Earth." She did not need to explain further. Everybody knew. "The question before us is simple," she continued. The Vreth Dominion, for the first time in its history, withdrew from an active conquest. The target was a pre-spaceflight civilization with no energy weapons and no interstellar capability. They withdrew anyway. She paused. "We need to understand why, and we need to understand what it means for us." The debate that followed lasted 2 weeks. Some species argued that it was a tactical pause. The Vreth were regrouping, rebuilding, would return. This was the most comfortable interpretation because it required no change in thinking. The Vreth were still the Vreth. The galaxy was still the galaxy. Some species argued that the Vreth had simply made a resource calculation, and the humans had gotten lucky. Any species with a low enough resource profile relative to its resistance potential could get the same result. This was also a comfortable interpretation, because it reduced the humans to an economic variable. Some species argued that the humans were genuinely different, and that this needed to be examined much more carefully. This was the uncomfortable interpretation, and it was the one that would not go away. The Vethnorn were old. Not just old for a civilization. Old in the way that only a handful of species in the known galaxy were old, predating the Vreth Dominion by several thousand years, having watched empires rise and fall from the comfortable distance of a system that was too far from anything valuable to be worth conquering. They were small. They were quiet. They were, most of the time, not interested in assembly debates. Their ambassador, a creature that appeared to be mostly translucent fiber arranged in a humanoid shape, spoke on the 3rd day of the debate. He spoke very slowly. The Vethnorn always did. "We have," he said, "been watching the signals from Earth for 112 of their years, since before the Vreth began watching. We have been watching because their electromagnetic broadcasts were unusual." He paused for so long that the assembly moderator thought he was finished. He was not. What was unusual, he continued, was the content, the stories they tell, the patterns in them. We have observed 63 species at the developmental stage Earth is currently in. All 63 show similar patterns: resource acquisition, territorial expansion, internal conflict, standard, expected. He paused again. Earth shows these patterns, but Earth also shows something else. a specific story structure that we have not encountered in the others. A story type that appears across all cultures, all regions, all time periods, without exception. The chamber was attentive in a very specific way. The story of the small thing that wins, he said. Not through power, not through resources, through endurance, through the refusal to stop. He paused. In 63 species, we have not found this story structure as a dominant cultural motif. We find it occasionally. We find it as a subset. In Earth, it is not a subset. It is the center. Their oldest stories, their newest entertainment, their children's first lessons, their elders' final teachings, all of it, the same structure. The small and the outmatched facing the large and powerful, and winning. He paused for a very long time, not always surviving, but winning. The chamber sat with that. We believe, the Vethnorn ambassador said, that the Vreth found the one species in the known galaxy that was, in some biological and cultural sense, specifically configured to defeat them. Not militarily, not technologically, in the only way that matters long-term, in cost, in the unwillingness to make it stop. The Vreth are a rational civilization. They left because the math stopped working. He turned his translucent head slowly around the chamber. The math stopped working because of what the humans are, what they were made into by their history, and what they will continue to be. He sat down. The debate continued for another 11 days, but the center of gravity had shifted. On Earth, 3 years after the invasion, a different kind of work was happening. The radioactive mountain pass was being monitored and slowly, carefully cleaned. It would take decades. It had already been renamed. The name translated differently in different languages, but the core of it was the same. The pass we held. The occupied city had been recovered. The fires were out. The rebuilding was done in stages, and the new buildings were different from the old ones, not because the designs had changed dramatically, but because the people building them had. They built storage into the foundations. They built the kind of redundancy into the power systems that you build when you have spent 9 days running communications through a gap in alien jamming. They built with the memory of what happened in the structure of what came next. This happened everywhere. Not just in the cities, in the thinking. The pre-invasion world had been one in which 7 billion humans spent a great deal of energy on the differences between themselves. Different nations, different languages, different resources, different grievances, all of it real, all of it important, all of it, when the drop pods started falling, immediately rearranged into its proper position, which was secondary. The post-invasion world was different, not completely different. The nations were still there. The languages were still there. The grievances were still there. People went back to arguing about politics and borders and resources, because that was what people did, and it did not stop being necessary just because aliens had arrived. But underneath it, something had changed. They had done the impossible thing together, not perfectly, not without cost, but together. And the knowledge of that sat in the bones of the species in a way that knowledge does when it is not learned from a book but from 9 days of actual experience. They knew something about themselves now that they had only suspected before. Rao, the young military analyst who had proposed, in the UN Security Council, making the cost too high, was 34 years old and teaching at a defense university when the Assembly Observer program began. The program was something new. Several species in the Galactic Assembly had, quietly and then less quietly, made contact with Earth through a channel that the Vreth blockade had not fully closed, a low-frequency relay system that Dmitry Volkov's team had built using the same frequency gap the Resistance had exploited during the invasion. It was slow. It was not ideal, but it worked. The contact was careful. Both sides were careful. The assembly species were careful because they did not entirely understand what they were dealing with. The humans were careful because they had very recently been invaded, and their trust for things from space was currently at a specific historical low. But the contact happened. And among the first things that came through the relay, after the basics, after the confirmations that these were different beings than the ones who had attacked, after the very delicate early exchanges of languages and good intent, was a question. The assembly wanted to know how the humans had done it, not tactically. Tactically, the assembly analysts had already reconstructed most of the engagement from the data they'd gathered. They wanted to know something else. They wanted to know what the humans had been thinking. Rao was part of the team that put together the answer. It took 6 months. It was pulled from interviews with generals, with militia fighters, with the 3 teenagers in Seoul, with Rashid in his mountain range, with Maya Tors on her hillside, with Amara Ndiaye, with Dmitry Volkov, with 100 other people who had been in different places doing different things during those 9 days. The answer, when it was compiled and translated and sent back through the relay, was not a military document. It was something closer to a portrait. A picture of what 7 billion people had thought and felt and done in 9 days when something arrived from space and told them to surrender. The assembly received it. It was passed through their translation systems. It was read by diplomats and military analysts and scientists and historians. And then it was read by the species who had been conquered. The 47. The absorbed worlds whose resources were now part of the Vreth dominion but whose people were still there, still alive, still existing under administrative control. It reached them through back channels, through the same kinds of information networks that had always carried things the powerful did not want to travel. It reached them. What happened after that was slow. Very slow. Nothing happens fast across the distances of space, but things happened. A species on the 8th absorbed world began quietly to not cooperate with their administrative structure. Not violently, just not cooperating, forgetting to file reports, having equipment fail at inconvenient times, losing records. The Vreth administration filed complaints, launched investigations, found nothing they could act on. On the 12th absorbed world, someone who had read the translated human document started teaching what the document described, what the humans had done, how they had organized without a center, how they had communicated through gaps, how they had made themselves expensive. The teaching spread slowly through back channels. On the 31st absorbed world, the Vreth administrative offices received a resource report that was, for the first time in 20 years of occupation, 12% below projection. The investigation concluded equipment failure. The investigation was probably correct, but the equipment that failed was equipment that had been working perfectly for 20 years, and it failed the same week on 17 separate locations. These things did not look like a revolution. A revolution had a face and a center. These things had neither. They were invisible as single incidents. They only became visible as a pattern, and patterns took time. Jalveth retired from active service 5 years after the withdrawal from Earth. He was given the appropriate ceremonies. He was given a formal acknowledgement of his service record. Nobody mentioned Earth in the public part of the ceremony. In the Senate, it was still a contested subject. The word withdrawal was still used by some senators as a kind of accusation, a thing that should not have happened, a mistake that would be corrected. In private, after the ceremony, Senator Vel Rasha, the young senator who had asked him what he thought of the humans, found him in a corridor and said, quietly, "What do you think is happening?" He looked at her, "In the Dominion." "Everywhere," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "I think," he said, "that we made a mistake long ago, not in the conquests, not in the resource decisions, in the assumption." He paused. "We assumed that when you defeat a species militarily, you defeat the thing that makes them resist. We assumed the resistance was a military phenomenon." He looked at the wall. "Earth showed us it is not. The resistance was a cultural phenomenon, a biological one. And we spread the information about it across 47 worlds when we distributed the human document." Velrasha was quiet. "So what do we do?" she asked. "I don't know," Jalveth said. "I have spent 90 years knowing what to do. I no longer know what to do." He paused. "I think that is the correct response to finding something you don't understand." She stood with him in the corridor for a moment. "Do you think they'll come back?" she asked. "The humans into space?" He thought about the blue planet, the children's stories, the small thing facing the large thing, the stubborn, irrational, deeply wired refusal. "Yes," he said, "they will come into space." "Should we be afraid of that?" He thought about it. "I think," he said, "that the answer to that depends entirely on how we behave between now and then." 20 years after the invasion, a human spacecraft left orbit. It was not a military ship. It was not large. It had a crew of 6 and enough supplies for a long journey and the kind of equipment that people bring when they are going somewhere nobody from their civilization has ever been, which means they bring everything they can think of and hope it is enough. They called it First Step, not because it was the first step into space. They had been into space before, in their small stations and their probes, but because it was the first step into the space that was no longer empty, the space that had something in it, other civilizations, other ships, other species who had been watching and waiting. The crew of 6 had gone through a selection process that took 3 years and involved most of the planet in some form. They were 6 very different people from 6 very different places with 6 different languages and 6 different backgrounds, and they had been chosen not for their differences, but for the thing they shared underneath the differences. They were the kind of people who had read the history, who knew the cost of the 9 days, who carried it with them not as a wound but as information, who had looked at the question of what came next and decided, without great drama, that next was where they were going. The 6 of them sat in a ship the size of a large bus and aimed it at the dark. They were not fast, not yet. Their ship was slower than any Vreth vessel by several orders of magnitude. The nearest assembly member world was years away at their current velocity. But they were going. In the galactic assembly, the signal was received. The relay stations that had been quietly placed near Earth's system by 3 different assembly member species, each working separately, all picked it up at almost the same time. A human spacecraft, leaving orbit, heading outward. The assembly floor went quiet when the news came in. Then slowly, something that had not happened in the assembly's 600-year history began to happen. Species that had nothing in common. Species that had old disputes and old grievances and old reasons not to agree on anything. Species that had watched each other with suspicion across the long dark for generations. They began to talk about meeting the ship, about going out to it. Not to intercept, not as the Vreth would intercept with power and certainty and the assumption of outcome, but to go and see, to extend something toward those 6 people in their small bus of a ship heading into the unknown. Ambassador T. Laren of the Solvathi, who had opened the debate 6 years ago, watched the assembly come alive around her and felt something she had not felt in a long time, something old and simple. Hope was not a Solvathi concept exactly. They had a word that was close. It meant the possibility you act toward. She felt that. She stood up without being recognized. The moderator, seeing her, gave her the floor. "The humans are coming," she said. "They are slower than us. They are newer than us. They have 1 ship and 6 people, and they are crossing a distance that for us is a short trip, and for them is the bravest thing any of their species has ever done." She paused. "I would like to propose that we go and meet them." The vote was unanimous. It was the first unanimous vote in the assembly in 22 years. In the small human ship, in the long dark between stars, a crew member named Lynn Nguyen sat at the observation window during her night cycle, which was a concept they had brought from Earth and maintained because humans needed a night cycle or they stopped functioning correctly. She looked at the stars. They were very far from home. They were very far from anywhere. The stars out here looked different than they did from Earth, not dramatically different, not enough that she couldn't find the old patterns if she looked for them, but different in the way things look when you are closer to them than you have ever been. She thought about the 9 days. She had been 19 during the 9 days. She had been in a basement in Hanoi with her family, listening to broadcasts on the low-frequency band, unable to do anything but listen. She had felt, during those 9 days, a specific helplessness that she had carried with her for a long time afterward. The selection process had asked her, eventually, why she wanted to go. She had said, "Because I was in a basement when they came, and I want to be somewhere else when what comes next comes." It was not a political answer. It was not a strategic one. It was the honest one. She sat at the window and looked at the stars for a long time. Then the long-range sensor pinged. She looked at the screen. Something was coming toward them. Several somethings, moving at a speed that was much faster than hers, coming from the direction of the assembly worlds. She hit the comm. "Everyone up," she said. "We have incoming." She looked at the screen again. The contacts were spreading out as they approached, not forming up in an attack pattern. She had spent enough time studying Vreth attack patterns to know what those looked like. They were spreading out in a way that looked like display, like showing themselves, like wanting to be seen. The 6 of them crowded around the sensors. The signals came from 17 different ships, 17 different species, all of them broadcasting on a frequency that the relay stations near Earth had been using for 2 years, the channel that humans and assembly had been using to talk, the channel that said, "We are trying to communicate." And underneath the signal data, a message. It came in their language, imperfect, some of the words slightly off, but in their language. "First Step Crew, this is the Galactic Assembly. We are here to welcome you." Lin Nguyen read the message twice. Then she looked at the 5 other people crowded around her in the small bus of a ship, far from home in the middle of the dark, and none of them said anything for a moment. Then the oldest among them, a geologist from Nigeria named Emmanuel, who was 58, and had the specific calm of someone who had already decided nothing would surprise him, said, "Well," he looked at the message, "I suppose we should answer." Lin Nguyen sat down at the communication console. She thought about what you say when the galaxy reaches toward you, when the long, terrible, expensive, exhausting thing your species went through turns out to have been, among other things, an introduction. She thought about what to say. Then she said it. "Galactic Assembly, this is asterisk first step. We read you," a pause. "We are very glad to hear from you." She sent the message. Outside the window, the 17 ships continued their slow, deliberate spread. 17 species, 17 civilizations, all of them old, all of them with their histories and their losses and their long memories of what the dark between stars had always been. All of them coming to meet the one species that had told that dark, asterisk no. The stars hung quiet around them, and the small human ship kept going, and the galaxy that had learned fear was, slowly, learning something else. What it was exactly, what came next, what they all became to each other across the long years ahead, none of them knew. But they were moving toward it. That was enough. That was, as it had always been for the species from the blue planet, exactly enough.